Welcome to the Animation Happy Hour, a podcast where we talk about breaking into the animation industry over a couple of drinks.
All opinions and views expressed in this podcast are solely our own and are not representative of the companies for whom we work. My name is Katie.
I'm Garrett. And I'm Ben, and we're all currently feature animators at Disney.
So today we are drinking pipe wine because we're talking about the pipeline.
So clever.
Right?
Pause for applause. Yeah.
Kudos again to Isabel, my girlfriend, for coming up with the drink.
She's incredible.
She's so good.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah,
Very
she's
good.
killing it. Maybe in the future we'll have her on as our featured mixologist, and she can cover this one because we're just being put to shame. So today we are going to be covering which animation job is right for you, and this is the CG feature film animation edition. So we're going to be talking about, as far as like CG feature film animation goes, we're talking about like the Blue Sky, DreamWorks, Pixar, Disney, Sony sort of films. We're going to be covering the different steps with the pipeline for that sort of thing. So we're going to be covering everything from story, lighting, editorial, production management, etc. We have a lot of different things to cover here. And the reason we wanted to do this episode was because, a lot of people are interested in working in animation, quote unquote. But, to be honest, to work at a place like Disney or DreamWorks or wherever, it's really such a broad generalization. There are so many disciplines within just working in quote unquote animation. And we know the outside world thinks of everybody that works at one of these studios as an animator, but That's not the case. There are a lot of different jobs and roles in each of these studios, and character animators, or animators, quote unquote, only make up a very small percentage of those people. So we're going to be covering everything there is. So we're going to go through those, and hopefully this is a valuable resource to, kind of see where you fit in best.
Just a quick disclaimer to say that this is going to be an extremely broad overview of the most common jobs you would see in a CG feature animation studio. We do plan on covering each of these jobs in much more detail. We actually are planning a future Day in the Life series where we'll talk to different artists in great detail about their jobs and what kind of their day-to-day looks like. So please stay tuned for that. But for now, we're going to structure this episode by listing each job in a linear order, reflecting how the pipeline actually works in a feature film studio. But we do want to note that working on a feature film, it's never truly linear. There's a ton of back and forth and changes that happen across and between departments all the time. I also wanted to give a disclaimer that the CG pipeline does vary a little bit studio to studio, but for the most part, they're all pretty similar. And we're going to try to kind of cover the broad CG pipeline in general. So what does that mean? It means that today we are covering storyboarding, production, editorial, visual development / concept art, modeling, rigging, surfacing, look dev, layout, character animation, crowds animation, character effects, tech anim, effects, general TDs, matte painting, lighting, compositing, image finaling, and sound design.
That's
Good
too many jobs, guys.
Gracious. Maybe we shouldn't do this episode. I don't know.
Yeah, let's call it quits.
So first, we're going to talk about development. And this is kind of a weird one to start with because it's not necessarily a job that you apply for, but it's very much the first step of the pipeline. Because generally the folks that work in development are the directors and the production staff that support the directors kind of in their research and brainstorming phase. So that could be production management people, secretaries, and development executives. So you wouldn't necessarily see entry-level positions offered in development, or even job listings in development. Because people might kind of be groomed to go into that department coming from a producing background or something like that.
So this is the very first step of the process when directors and development executives research / brainstorm their ideas for a film and finalize the script. And depending on the studio, they might develop an original idea internally or work on developing an outside pitch, script, or concept like a children's book or comic book.
So generally, these people have good research skills. There are people who are very knowledgeable about film language, different genres and such. Have to have a very good general knowledge, because development can really be anything, any type of film. Need to know about, your Westerns, your sci-fi, everything, just a couple examples.
And trends too.
Yeah, exactly.
Trends.
Kind of, exactly. Kind of have the pulse on what's, going on right now, and what will be very marketable 2-3 years from now, or even more. So it can be very challenging in that regard, for sure. Aside from that, that definitely good soft skills are super valuable. As working in the development stage of a movie, you're probably going to be interacting with people very high up in the studio and kind of all over. You'll be talking to directors, heads of studios, producers, executive producers, development people, because you'll be one of them. Also, viz dev people, stuff like that. You might also be talking to people even further down the pipeline, because you'll kind of want to have a pulse on maybe how much things will cost down the line too. So talking with those people. So it's really this broad knowledge you have to have, and you have to be able to talk to a variety of different people. Aside from that, you have to be able to facilitate the creative process and kind of provide guidance, structure, and research assistance. So all that is, it sounds very general, because it is very general. It could be, these are just, I feel like, overall very creative, smart, intelligent, people that are easy to work with and curious about a lot of different things. And, because there's a huge difference between Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse versus Trolls World Tour versus, any number of movies out there. So, if you're working in development, you have to kind of be able to handle all those different things.
Some quick fun facts about development. And a lot of these facts are probably fairly specific to Disney, but I imagine they might cross to other studios as well. Generally, development's a very small department. You might just have a handful of development executives working alongside directors. So it could, be a department of 5 to 15 people. For Disney, at least, I know they have the very sexy responsibility of organizing and going on research trips. So if you're working on a movie like Zootopia, maybe the development executives there handled the job of organizing the safari trips that they went on and then got to go. So that's a pretty nice perk. At Disney, at least, where directors develop original concepts, the development team is also in charge of kind of researching and keeping a pulse on who the hot writers are around the industry. And they'll actually hire and attach writers to write a script for our original concepts. And this is kind of a funny thing. Development is probably the most secretive department. Projects don't really come to life for 5 to 10 years. So everything that development works on is kept very close to the vest. And even the floor that development works on is forbidden to guests in our building and that kind of thing. Yeah. The last fun fact we have here is that development at a big company like Disney or Pixar, they work very closely with corporate, pitching their ideas and ultimately greenlighting a project.
So next, we're going to take it away with storyboard artists. The Explain Like I'm 5 for storyboard artists is basically storyboard artists interpret the script into a visual format. So they will take a look at the script and get assigned, a sequence, and then they'll make drawings that turn the words into a visual story. I like to think, to make it kind of a simple explanation, that it's like a comic book representation, but Isabel, my girlfriend, would be mad at me for I cringe. She does not like that. She says it's more of a blueprint of the movie. And I think because a comic book has a different connotation, but they'll also storyboard artists will pitch their ideas in a room with the directors and other storyboard artists for feedback. And they're really early on in the process and working with development and writers to get the film started. So Ben, what type of people would be interested in story?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked, but you of all people should know because you're dating one. But, so a storyboard artist, possibly first and foremost, they must enjoy drawing. You are drawing every day, all day, except for when you're pitching. But really, this is when the movie's coming together for the first time, and it's all through literally drawings in Photoshop or Storyboard Pro or something like that. But so you have to be comfortable with doing that all the time. Aside from that, a good working knowledge of cinematography, film language, pretty much everything related to film. Be able to talk about the nitty gritty of camera work in a particular shot, and also character arcs and, high level stuff where, the 3-act structure of most films and stuff. You kind of have to be a generalist in that sense, because you are crafting the film from the start, just through your drawings. So you have to know all that stuff. On top of that, acting skills can be really important, and to be able to, essentially, like we said, it's providing a blueprint for the film. So you have to be able to show what characters are feeling at any particular point in time in the movie and be able to convey that through your drawings. It's also great to be able to be interested or able to improv a little bit, to improvise, because a lot of times storyboard artists are asked they might be given very specific instructions on a particular sequence or shot, but other times it's very loosey-goosey, and they'll just say, hey, we want this to be funnier, or take this, we want it to be really intense, and you have to be able to take that and run with it. So definitely able to come up with your own ideas is a huge part of your responsibility as well. And then the last thing we have written down here is your ability to iterate extensively. And this is something we will continue to say for a lot of the other professions, but definitely with storyboard artists, it's an absolute must. There has never... I'm just going to say that. I know you're not supposed to say never, but I would say there has never been a movie that was just storyboarded once and then that was the final movie that hit the screen. Usually movies go through countless different iterations and are storyboarded a million different times, especially in the feature film world. So you have to be comfortable with, storyboarding the same sequence multiple different ways, or totally throwing out your work and starting anew. So that's absolutely integral as well.
Yeah, I think on Wreck-It Ralph 2, since I was story PA, I remember that we ended up with a crazy final count of number of boards, which was like in the hundreds of thousands for the number of storyboards our team produced. Wow. So yeah, you have to want to draw a lot and be flexible and willing to throw away work and start again for sure. Moving on to our third section, the fun facts of storyboarding. This is, again, another pretty small department. There's usually just a handful of storyboarders on a film. I think the max a story team might hit is like 20 to 25 people, and it could be as small as 5 to 10 people. Storyboarding is definitely a team sport. Like at a place like Disney, when you pitch your boards, the entire story team is in there, and everyone can kind of throw out ideas and help sort of elevate and plus the story. As a disciplined, story can certainly be very competitive to get into because, it's kind of a smaller department, and it does really require like a very strong knowledge of film and strong drawing skills, which not everybody has. Story is a department that's not generally outsourced as much as some other departments. Like generally, storyboarders work very closely with the director, and a lot of the storyboarding is done kind of in-house. So that's something to keep in mind if you're someone who prefers to work remotely or you're international. This is a fun one. Story is generally compensated very well because it is a competitive job. And it's something that people have to be kind of highly specialized and skilled for.
I think it's interesting because storyboard artists, I think there's a lot of parallels between story and animation, except story artists think bigger picture versus animators thinking very micro. And this comes up a lot because in Isabel's day-to-day, she'll be thinking like, what shot choices can I make to make this character feel scared or isolated. So like, oh, should I do like a lot of high angle shots looking down on the character or whatever? Mm-hmm. Whereas I feel like my day-to-day is like, what brow shape will convey cautious optimism, or like what degree of like the mouth corner going up is the right form of happy for a character.
Yeah.
So I just think it's funny, like it's all revolving around story, but it's just high level versus really granular.
Very good point.
So yeah. All right, so next we're going to talk about visual development artists / concept artists. Viz dev artists kind of work simultaneously to storyboard artists in the pipeline.
And basically the 5,000-foot view for this, a general explanation is that you are the people who kind of start visualizing the more specific aspects of the film. So this could encompass background artists. It could, be doing environment design. It could be character design and could also be props and stuff. It's basically the whole look of the film. So, everything you see when you watch a movie was initially conjured up or rendered or drawn by someone who worked in visual development.
Yeah, absolutely. And you might enjoy being a visual development artist if you enjoy drawing and painting. I mean, that's the number one thing you're doing day to day. So you definitely have to enjoy doing that. And in addition to that, you have to enjoy or be able to iterate extensively. And that kind of applies to a lot of other jobs, but nonetheless, it's still important for Viz dev. And you also have to have a good knowledge of color theory, shape language, and just establishing tone with color and all sorts of stuff like that. So, yeah.
Fun facts for Viz dev. There's usually, again, just a small handful of visual development artists on a film. I feel like our visual development department at Disney is under 30 people for sure, maybe even under 20. And for that reason, it is a very, very competitive field to get into. Not only is the visual development team usually pretty small, but I think as one of the parts of the pipeline, it's also one discipline that has the lowest barrier of entry because you kind of need general art training and familiarity with Photoshop and digital painting illustration, which is something that can be kind of self-taught or learned slightly more easily. I hesitate to say easily, but generally you don't have to go as crazy learning like a new software like you would with like effects or CG animation or something like that. So it is an extremely competitive field, and I would argue it might even have the most applicants of any of the disciplines we're going to mention today.
That's a very good point. I'm glad you brought that up because I feel like so many people get into, I feel like I whistled there. So many people get into animation because they just love how it looks. So, it is a super competitive field, and I would agree that the applicants versus working professionals ratio is insane. I mean, to give you some context, and I don't say this to be discouraging to anybody, but if you look at like all the Ice Age movies, character design fits kind of within visual development. And the Ice Age movies essentially had one character designer, Peter DeSev, for like all of them, so we say that just to prepare people to know the realities of, if you're interested in this, there's a ton of people who want to do it in very few positions.
One character designer can move between films and even between studios sometimes, kind of working various freelance gigs project to project. So the work is definitely limited and extremely competitive.
Yeah.
Maybe this is something you guys would know. I was always curious about this for Viz dev artists, but does a Viz dev artist need to be kind of like a chameleon with their style where they can do a lot of different styles? Or do you guys think it's important to have your own voice and kind of stick to a consistent style? Because I feel like as an animator, we have to be able to animate, like comedy and drama. And we definitely have our specialties, but I wonder if that's important for a Viz dev artist because there's so few. But I don't know. I was curious about that.
It's a really good question. I don't know, because we talk about this every now and then, and we think like if you take a Corey Loftus, it seems like he can do pretty much whatever. Like he did some really realistic stuff, he did some super cartoony stuff. But then there are people who, I'm thinking of some of the Viz dev artists like at Leica, who had like very distinct styles, and like
Heidi Smith.
Yes, Heidi Smith. Yeah, she has a very distinct style, and they wanted that with her. So I don't know. And honestly, I think it can be like both. Yeah, some people will be hired onto a film just because they have a very specific style. And then some people will be hired just because they're kind of a jack of all trades and can do anything. So it's really tough to say.
Good. Yeah, I agree. I think versatility doesn't hurt because like if you're an environment designer, you might get assigned one day to design Otta Holland, which is like a completely abstract location. Or you might get assigned to design like the video game Hero's Duty in Wreck-It Ralph 2, which is like a very specific thing. So definitely you have to be flexible and versatile and able to conquer different things. The next department in the pipeline is the editorial department. And generally, the editorial department is comprised of editors who compile all of the footage into one master cut that the directors use to continually evaluate the movie. They will take, storyboards or existing animation, whatever is kind of the latest cut of a shot or sequence, and edit that into the movie. They are in charge of all of the voice records, so it's a pretty sexy part of the job. They get to work with the celebrity voice talent, and
it's getting sexier.
Yeah. Hey. And they also
John C. Reilly.
They will also kind of bring sight and sound together. So in addition to editing and dialogue, they will also edit in temp music and scratch dialogue early on in the film. So editorial, they work with every department throughout the entire pipeline because they're constantly trying to edit the latest cut of the film. And it's kind of where the movie lives throughout the entire animation process. Unlike live action, editing is involved throughout the entire animation pipeline. They are involved beginning with story through the very end through sound design. So I know in live action film, like generally you don't really start editing until everything has already been shot.
That's right. And if you are interested in becoming an editor, it is very likely that you are organized and creative. You are super detail oriented, but also you're able to see the big picture. You're able to see the forest and the trees, if you will. You're knowledgeable. You have a great working knowledge of cinematography and film language. And you are also, as we said with Story before, comfortable iterating.
All right, so fun facts about editors. Like Katie mentioned, if you're an editor working in animation, you're likely to be involved earlier in the process than in like live action. Because in live action, typically the thing gets filmed and then you're done. You're doing your thing at the final stage. And in animation, you're basically involved from the beginning. And as a result, the workload is it can be pretty intense because you're constantly putting together clips, the latest clips from every department for screenings and stuff. So it can be a intense workload for sure. And you're also working very closely with the directors throughout the process. You're constantly, coming up with cuts to show the directors, and they're analyzing it, and they're, making tweaks. And, in animation, we might add 10 frames because we think, oh, we need this performance thing. And then now it makes your life a living hell because you're like, okay, I have to now add these 10 frames here. And so it's tricky. But it's nevertheless a very important part of the process. And one thing that I find really interesting about editing is if you do your job well as an editor, no one really notices it. So no one really, it's rare you see a movie and someone's like, wow, the editing was really good on that movie, because if they don't notice it, that means you've done a good job. But if you've done a bad job, they'll be like, I was confused with the kind of cuts and stuff like that. So I find that interesting. And actually that applies to a lot of jobs in animation. Like when you do your job well, no one notices.
I'll give a couple of anecdotes about a couple of the points you just mentioned, like the crunch not ending. I remember assisting with editorial that our head editor literally didn't have a day off for 4 weeks at a time. And we legally were obligated to give him a single day off every 4 weeks or so or something. So he would get his one day off occasionally.
It's insane. But because of that, I will say they're generally very well compensated.
Yeah.
Right? Especially the the head editor on a feature film, it's because they're basically a director. You know, they're making decisions about everything in the movie, you know, like, you know, where these shots cut, how long this is, you know, those were just two very basic things, but really they touch everything in the movie. So they're about as close to the director as you can get. So yeah,
they're hugely involved with the pacing. They can definitely be the difference between a joke working or not working because of the timing and just anything like that.
So remember back when we were talking about how viz dev artists design all of the assets in a movie in 2D or drawing form? Well, those drawings need to become CG at some point, and that is the job of CG modelers. So modelers construct the digital versions of everything that is seen on screen in an animated film, from characters, environments, props, all that stuff. And they basically take the 2D drawings and designs that the viz dev artists work on, and then they sculpt them in CG software to make them 3D. So for instance, like Frozen, if we're using that as an example, you know, Anna and Elsa were designed in 2D as 2D drawings, and then the CG modelers basically sculpted those characters in CG so that later the riggers and the animators could work on them, because we're making CG films after all. So that can apply to environments, characters, props, like I said, and it's kind of what they do.
So modelers, the type of person and the kind of the skill set that they usually have, they're extremely artistic. They're able to match and work off of the 2D viz dev designs that they're given, and they can kind of extrapolate and elaborate where necessary. So usually, you know, for a character, they might only be given a quarter or a 3/4 view, a profile view, a front view, back view. But they have to make sure that that character looks good from 360 degrees, literally any and every camera angle that character would be shot at. It has to look good. They are also technical, so they have to make sure that they are keeping an eye on the edge flow, that they're optimizing the geo and making sure that the vertex count is reasonable, or the quad count. And they also, lastly, have a very in-depth knowledge of anatomy often. They are probably very familiar with muscles and kind of what sort of muscular system a character might have, whether it's a creature or a human or whatever the film calls for.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, you know, just to extrapolate on that, they probably need to know a lot about just about everything too. Like if you're going to be designing a building or something, they have to know, you know, all that stuff, or if they're doing trees and foliage, you might have to learn about that. So a good, a curious person might be a good modeler as well. And as far as additional fun facts, when you're working in modeling, you probably work most closely with viz dev and rigging. You're kind of going back and forth with, you know, as we said, your basic responsibility is in interpreting 2D designs into the 3D world. So, and as we all know, a lot of times things do not interpret the way you think they would with, you know, certain designs. And then all of a sudden when you have them in 3D, it's like, oh, wow, that's way more unappealing than it looks on the paper. So you have to make adjustments. So a lot of the job is that sort of thing, where you have to kind of go back and forth with a designer and figure out the best compromises for, you know, getting the whatever 2D appeal there was into the 3D world. And then also you're going to be interacting with rigging a lot. Like Katie said, you have to worry about the technical side of, you know, edge flow, optimizing the geo, and, you know, making sure you have enough topology so it looks great, but not so much that it's super heavy and nobody can use it because it takes so much computing power. So there's a lot of that involved as well. So the next step in the process is rigging. So for the quick layman's explanation, in rigging, you're taking the 3D model and putting the parts in the character that will later be animated. To make an analogy or a simile, it's kind of like a mechanic versus a driver is like a rigger versus an animator, whereas the rigger is the mechanic, the animator is the driver. So you're kind of doing all the things under the hood to make the 3D model animatable, per se. So riggers create digital skeletons for 3D CG characters. These skeletons or rigs are like puppets that define the movements of a character or creature. It could be anything like how a big cat runs, or how a person's face moves, or how they might raise an eyebrow. Can really be anything. So riggers often have to have an in-depth knowledge of, anatomy and, a number of things.
Awesome. And if you understand what riggers are now and you're not in animation, congratulations, because that is I feel like no one knows what riggers are. I try to explain to people what a rigger does.
Yeah.
And, it never goes well.
It's funny because it's like one of the most important parts of the steps of the pipeline.
Absolutely.
But so few people know about it.
So you might enjoy rigging if you appreciate both the technical and artistic challenges that present itself with rigging, because that certainly plays a part, especially when it comes to matching anatomy. And specifically, I'm remembering movies that I was on where there was bird characters, and I remember the rigger. I'm thinking of Larrikins, and Jared Snover was the rigger responsible for doing the feathers on the wings, and he studied reference and tried to analyze how exactly it attaches to the skin, the feathers, and what happens when the bird folds, and what happens to the deformations on the skin and the feathers. So basically being able to apply real world anatomy in a 3D context is really important. Some scripting skills may be required too. Actually, definitely will be required if you're a rigger. And in general, just being a good problem solver. That's a very important thing as well.
Fun facts about riggers. They generally work extremely closely with animation, modeling, and viz dev. There's tons of back and forth trying to get the characters to kind of the best quality that they possibly could be. So after the first rig, maybe an animator does a quick test, and then they realize that when they bend something or pose something a certain way, the deformations get weird. So then the rigger would hop back in and possibly even work with modeling to try to get things looking more appealing and more on model. And they might even have to make specialized setups or rigs for specific shots or scenes. So maybe you have a movie like Moana where there's a lot of rope animation, and she's animating, or she's acting on a boat, and the boat is swaying on the water. So in that context, a rigger might build a specific rig for the boat, and they might also within that build a setup for the sail and the ropes attached to that sail, so that you can kind of expect unique challenges depending on the films that you're going to work on.
I have a stupid story, but I don't know if it's even worth talking about.
Do it.
It's worth it.
I'll just do it. Fine. I remember when I was at DreamWorks, I was doing a lot of rig wrecking, which basically means testing the rigs. And a lot of times that was obvious rig issues, if you move the arm up and the chest will explode. I would write that on a document, and then they would fix that. But sometimes there was opportunities where I could add creative notes. And I was like, ooh, maybe if I add something really cool and spicy, they'll promote me and I'll be cool and really valued. Yeah. And I remember, this is so stupid, oh my God. But there was this dingo character, and for some reason I thought that dingo character needs to have really pronounced shoulder blades, kind of like a panther when it's walking. I was like, that would be really cool. But a panther's a panther. There's no reason a dingo has that. But anyways, I wrote on the doc, I was like, oh yeah, you should have some more pronounced shoulder blades on the dingo. And I remember the head rigger, Kevin Oakes, got it and called me up and was basically like, Garrett, a dingo is a canine and not a feline, so that's not the correct deformation. So I'm not going to apply that note. And I was like, okay. I was like, I'm so sorry. But I guess the point of that story is the riggers really have a good knowledge of anatomy, or maybe it's just that I have zero knowledge of it. I don't know what the point is.
No,
that's why you're an animator, not a rigger.
Exactly.
Yeah.
JK.
No, I love that story because it really does show that riggers do have to have a good knowledge of what they're doing. It's not about what Garrett was saying. A panther looks cool, but it's not built the same way as a dingo. So it's not just making something look cool. It's understanding the, working mechanisms of a particular prop or character or animal. And that is awesome. So like, one of the riggers at DreamWorks, Evan, is it, I feel so embarrassed. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. Boucher or Boucher or whatever. Oh my God, Evan, we're like good friends too, but I realize that I've never said his last name now. But he's like one of the most intense like animal fans I know, and I thought I was a big animal fan, but it's so cool that he's
so passionate about it.
Yes, he has such an in-depth knowledge of different creatures and dinosaurs and modern day animals, and directly puts those into his work, and makes the character. I think DreamWorks does some of the best creature animation out there, and I think it's because of people like Evan, who really know their stuff and are able to say like, okay, so this dragon is kind of like a chicken mixed with a bird mixed with this, and he is able to interpret that into putting the controls into the character to allow them to move a certain way, which is incredible. And I'm so humbled by their knowledge, both of the technical and artistic side of things. It's amazing.
The next part of the pipeline is the surfacing and look dev department. And for the beginning kind of layman's explanation of this department, generally look dev artists will sort of define how different surfaces and elements react to light and appear on the screen. So another way to think about this is, what is something made of? Is it made of skin? Is it made of fabric? Is it made of metal? That kind of thing. And they will also be actively interpreting 2D designs from VizDev. They'll definitely look up reference material. So if they're looking up the costume for Moana, maybe they're looking up Polynesian grasses and that sort of thing. And they're generally sort of taking artistic direction and translating that into 3D textures and surfacing.
Well said.
Nice.
Thank you.
If you are interested in being a surfacing / look dev person, artist, I guess I should say, you should be a mix of both technical and artistic. In addition to that, you should be able to study and replicate real world materials. But in addition to that, you should also be able to imagine fictional materials. Like if you have a character that, okay, this is like a, I don't know, godlike being made out of some sort of plasma or something. That's the first thing I thought of, a plasma god. I don't know why. But yeah, as we know, animation doesn't deal with only what is real life. So you have to be able to, be very artistic and imagine new things too and make them look real. And then also you have to have a good knowledge of light and color theory, since there's a lot of overlap between your department and the lighting department. You have to see not only like what color this is, but how it's going to show on camera when it's exposed to different lights and, things like that. So probably have to be a good, very good artistic, almost painterly eye in that sense as well.
Yeah, it is a cool balance between like artistic and technical, which is why I feel like this job could be super appealing to people who are interested in both those things. And some fun facts about surfacing and look dev artists are they're probably working most closely with visual development artists, because the viz dev artists are going to be defining sort of like how things look, like whether it's like if Ben was saying like the godlike plasma, the viz dev artist.
Oh yeah, the plasma god. Yeah,
the plasma god. We're gonna go with that. And maybe they drew. I'm imagining like kind of like the surface of the sun, like on the character, and then the surface artist looks at that and is like, how the F am I supposed to make this into CG?
That's what they say every time. How the F?
Yeah, what the F? Yeah. Why did this person design it that way? No, but that's, yeah. So they're going to be kind of doing a back and forth between the viz dev artists and making sure that the original intent is preserved, as well as, of course, talking to the director and making sure, because sometimes like the translation from 2D to CG is a challenge. Like it doesn't really go the way you expect. So that I'm sure that's a fun challenge, but just worth noting.
Yeah. You know what? In just to jump on the train of different departments you might work with, there might be just a tiny bit of overlap with animation too. Because animation, a lot of times we really want to like push and pull things. So you might say like, okay, on this frame, I really want to have a crazy stretch frame of this arm. And a lot of times it's actually surfacing and look dev you would have to check with to see like, okay, if I really stretch this or if I scale it up here, is the surfacing built to handle that? Or is it going to like totally break the texture? So it's going to look really weird to camera. So there's a, you know, like Garrett said, it's not as much overlap with animation as those other departments, but there's a tiny bit for sure.
Yeah, and certainly a lot of interactivity with lighting because they're definitely actively deciding how things are going to either reflect or absorb light.
Good point.
You know, depending on what color something is, it might only absorb certain color wavelengths and that kind of thing. So lots of interaction there. And kind of a fun like little anecdote for an example of something that a look dev department might work on. This is something that my sister actually really loves because she is a chef and she took a lot of she super appreciated that in Ratatouille, the chef characters in kind of their skin look dev actually had burns on their arms, which tons of chefs go through. So my sister
cool.
like super noticed that detail that some look dev artists put in to actually like paint burns onto kind of the skin and the, what do they call it? That wrap that you put on a character.
UV map.
The UV map, yeah.
So if you like in painting burnt skin on the flesh of the characters, you might like.
I know that's a pretty specific like.
No, it's cool though.
Yeah.
The details.
And I mean, it definitely would extend to something like freckles on a character's face, or even the
toothlesses, scales and stuff.
That's another great example.
It could be like anything. It's really cool.
Oh my gosh, now I want to be. I'm so excited about it.
That's right.
So that brings us to the layout department. And just to give a simplified explanation of what layout artists do, this is the step between storyboards and animation. It's kind of where the 2D boards are first interpreted into a CG environment, because obviously when you see the boards, there's no depth in the panels, right? The layout artists have to sort of interpret the depth and make it work in a CG environment. So characters, environments, and models are given depth and placed in a way that satisfies the director's and the storyboard artist's intent. And there's sort of two kind of distinctions in layout. There's the rough layout, which is what I just talked about. It's interpreting the boards into CG. And then there's final layout, which is preparation for animation and final composition. So that's stuff like, if the animator has done his or her thing, the final layout might do a pass at the camera to really finesse it, make it look good, in addition to a stereo pass to make everything work in 3D. So there's a lot to this, but that's sort of the simplified explanation of what layout artists do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the type of person or skill set that a layout artist would likely have is they generally have a very, very strong knowledge of cinematography and film language. So they absolutely know like what a Dutch angle is, for example, or a wide shot, mid shot, etc. And you can kind of think of them as a 3D storyboarder because like Garrett said, they're generally interpreting the storyboards and bringing them into 3D film. And they're also going to have to iterate extensively. If you actually take a look at the documentary series Into the Unknown, at one point they actually interview a layout artist, and in his scene he has like 20 different cameras as he's trying to figure out how to do one shot and what's kind of the best shot for that. So within that, they also have a very strong knowledge of how a camera works and like what depth of field they want, what type of lens they want to use. So super strong knowledge of how cameras work because cameras in CG are actually very similar or completely the same as cameras in live action. And lastly, they have a very good sense of timing, movement, and composition. So they are also going to help with the pacing. They are going to be in charge of camera moves and that sort of thing. And they figure out how to tell the story through the camera.
That's right. Yeah. All well said. And, just some fun facts or miscellaneous info about layout artists is generally they work most closely with editorial, animation, and the story departments. Editorial, that's kind of self-explanatory. Basically, everybody works with editorial, but with layout in particular, you're really deciding how long individual shots are. And, like Katie said, you're setting up the official cameras and everything. So it's very important for establishing the final look of the film. And with story, like Katie said, you're interpreting their boards. So there a lot of collaboration there is very important. And then with animation, that's kind of like the final camera, so you have to work very closely with the animators in that regard. And as we all know, in animation, if the camera is tweaked just slightly, it means you have to sometimes totally redo your animation or rework it. So it's very important that there's a very good working relationship between layout and animation. And I should say kind of, we've said before that, layout artists are kind of like 3D storyboarders. And, that's true. And I should say that at every part of every step of the process in the pipeline, everybody's trying to plus things, right? So a lot of times, if there's a really dynamic sequence, it could look really cool on the boards, but the layout artist is trying to make that even cooler and more dynamic and directing your eye through the screen. And they're taking advantage with working with different focal lengths and lenses and different timings and cool camera moves. So it can be a really cool dynamic department for sure. I imagine you have to be a really good storyteller in general to work in layout.
Yeah, I kind of like to think of layout as like the filmmakers of the studio because of that knowledge of camera and stuff. And I was really struck by, I feel like there's a lot of people who have this conception of layout as like, oh, this just looks like badly animated scenes or something, and this looks kind of janky.
It's such a shame, right? Because
it's not right. I think I was first struck by the importance of layout when I was at DreamWorks, and a layout soup was giving his presentation of how he wanted to do the cinematography for a movie, and he listed his film influences. He listed when he would use certain shots, I'm going to use close-ups during the emotional moments of the story so we feel this way with the character. We're more intimate versus the wider shots. And just I was totally inspired. I was like, oh my gosh, this is the coolest thing. You are making these decisions that's going to have a really good impact on how the audience feels emotionally. And they're not even going to realize. And that's the last thing I want to say about layout is it's another hidden talent thing where no one sees a movie and says, wow, the layout was really good, because they don't really know about what they did. But it's such an important job, because if it's bad, you're going to be confused about shot choices. You're going to be confused about a lot of stuff going on. So I know I'm going on a tangent, but I think it's a really inspiring department that does so much work that isn't immediately appreciated.
I'm so glad you said that. And I know we want to keep things moving here, but I do think it's worth giving layout some extra props just because it is such an underappreciated step of the pipeline. And I'm reminded of another specific anecdote on, it's kind of similar to what you were talking about, Garrett. On Trolls World Tour, the head of layout was talking about the difference between the different musical worlds. And if you go back and watch that,
cool.
They took inspiration from different music videos and stuff. And it was so cool to see kind of his sizzle reel or inspiration reel, which is where in the country music troll world, they have these very slow panning, that's really amazing. Really calculated, smooth robotic shots. Robotic's not the right word, but you know what I mean. Very intentional.
Still shots.
Exactly. With very slow pans and stuff. And then whenever they were in the rock and roll world, they tried to have more of a handheld, gritty feel. And he was literally putting all these different music videos up on screen. In the pop world, it was a little more... Between the two, it was a little more of a deliberate camera, but it was, very well choreographed, but it was really high energy. So a lot of cuts and stuff. And it was so cool. You know, you're putting like this artistic spin on the movie that a lot of people, it's like you said, they're going to feel it more than see it. But it's such a cool step of the process.
I do have an anecdote on that note too, very quickly. We went to a talk with the head of layout and cinematography on Inside Out as well. And he made a very conscious decision to change the film language and cameras between the real world and the mind world. So in the real world, he used lots of handheld cameras to kind of give an uneasy, anxious feeling. Whereas in the mind world, they kind of stuck to more traditional cinematography with elaborate camera moves and still shots and that kind of thing. So
that's super cool.
And that's another example of something that is very much like unconscious, like that the viewer would not be actively aware of, but it still gives you a feeling and it still tells the story in a subtle way. Yeah.
Even, I remember even in the real world, they had some distortion around the edges that was like barely perceptible, but it was based on real world distortion you get from an actual camera.
Yeah.
Versus in the mind world, it was like perfect because it wasn't the real world. It was in the mind. And
I got to rewatch that movie. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so layout, please know we love you. We're giving you props. It's a very underappreciated department, as are a lot of these departments, but yeah, layout in particular. So next in the pipeline, we are talking about character animation.
Woo!
Finally.
Hashtag favorite.
So that is what all three of us do, and basically, as a character animator, you're kind of like the actor of the movie. That doesn't sound conceited at all, does it? So this, as a character animator, you kind of, you make the characters move, emote, etc. It's what an actor does, you are doing for your 3D puppet in the computer, to put it as simply as possible.
And you might like character animation if you enjoy practicing acting skills, or you have a knack for that. You also are able to appreciate strong design and posing, have a knowledge of anatomy and locomotion, as well as ability to study and replicate real-world physics. It's also very important. And there's definitely a technical aspect to it. We're definitely artists working on a computer, so being able to be like adept in softwares and figuring out constraints and all that stuff is a really good asset as well. So if you feel like you enjoy these things, character animation might be for you.
Some fun facts about our department. We generally work with lots of different departments, depending on the shot. And generally, we work most closely with character effects or tech anim, who are the artists handling cloth and hair, and effects, because a lot of what we do directly will impact effects. So if we have characters walking in snow, or we have Elsa doing her sort of ice magic, that will directly impact effects.
A character breathing fire.
Such as Bruni the salamander.
That's right.
We experience lots of variety in our department. So shot by shot, what we work on can vary tremendously. You could be working on a dragon one week, and then a couple weeks later, you're working on Elsa singing, or perhaps a reindeer, that kind of thing. So we have lots of variety in what we animate. In addition to working with lots of different departments, we also work extremely closely with the directors. We have lots of face-to-face time where we go back and forth with directors, kind of trying to get the best performance possible for the characters in the shot.
So actually a fun little anecdote. When I started at DreamWorks, Simon Otto, who was the head of character animation on How to Train Your Dragon 3, said to me, this is where the rubber really meets the road. And what I think he meant by that was not that it's more important than any other department, certainly, but that character animation is one of the places where, okay, now you're like really deciding what the final look of the film is going to be like. And to an extent, you could say that about layout as well, certainly. But layout is, very much fluid, and they do a lot of iterations, and, every department does. But once something is animated, and it's animated specifically to camera, meaning you've posed a character in such a way that it looks the best from this particular camera view, that's usually when things like really become locked and then start to go down the pipeline, and then it just becomes about plussing that shot. So it's kind of the first time, the first moment where you start to see shots in sort of a final form, I would say. Mm-hmm. And it's the part of the pipeline where things start costing a lot of money. Obviously, everything's expensive, but if you have an animator working on a 10-second shot, they might be working on it for 3-4 weeks. And then, this is obviously in the feature film world, like we've said for all of these, but so then if you have a note that comes up when you're 2 days away from finishing your shot, all of a sudden that means another, maybe week or few weeks of work. So it's where things like really start to cost a lot of money, and where iterating can be very costly. And yeah, like we said, it's where you're starting to see the final shots in a very raw form, yes, but it's where it's like, okay, this is what the movie is going to look like. It's kind of the first step of that, you could say, with some argument, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how you guys feel, but sometimes it really stresses me out to think that what I'm animating in my Maya scene or whatever software I'm in, this is going to be on screen. Like the movement of the characters is going to be on screen. Yeah, and you're like, if I cringe at any point in my animation, like that cringe will be lived on in eternity.
Totally.
So you can't have that cringe.
Yeah, I always think about that when I'm like stressed about a deadline and I'm debating like, should I simplify, and it's okay if I don't make this absolutely perfect, if just to hit the deadline. The other part of my sort of inner voice says, no, this is going to live forever. Yeah. So it's okay if you go over a little bit. You have to make it as good as you possibly can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Closely related to animation is the crowds department, the next part of the pipeline. And the crowds department can often be kind of comprised of two separate types of artists. You might have crowds animators who are very often animating cycles and that sort of thing. And you will also have crowds technical artists. And the crowds technical artists are in charge of taking the cycles that the crowds animators make and kind of populating the scenes, whether it's like a town or a city or something like that. The crowds tech artists will actually take cycles and propagate them throughout an environment. And it's kind of a skill set that involves simulations and more technical skills, but they are actively doing things like taking a walk cycle and adding a motion path. So maybe it's a walk cycle that usually just goes straight, but they kind of can add a bend or a curve to that motion path. They will offset animations. So maybe within a shot, you might have 3 different guys using the same cycle, but you make sure that they kind of start the cycle at different times so you don't pick up on the fact that they're all using the same animation. And they can even do things like layering in head turns or blinks. So maybe like a main character will walk by and do something kind of broad. So then the crowds artists decide, let's have some of the townspeople turn their heads like they're noticing and following that action. So it's a pretty cool department where they can really get creative and do unique things.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're interested in working in this area, like we said, it's kind of tricky to give the exact type of person or skills you may have, because we are kind of talking about 2 different categories within one department here. But if you are specifically a cycles animator, generally, the type of person you are is the exact same as a character animator, because that's what you're doing every day. And the only caveat we would say is generally you may be a little more focused on general body mechanics than specific acting or things like that. And again, I hesitate to say that because of course with cycles and crowds, you still want good acting and stuff, but it may be, exactly, a personality to your cycles, but it may be a little more focused on, okay, we need, 4 different cycles of people doing a generic walk, and then 3 different cycles of somebody picking up a basket or something. So it can be very, very mechanics heavy.
It's
and generally
often a stepping stone for becoming later on like a staff character animator, which is the way the Disney Apprentice program is set up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And generally with cycles animators, with every shot you're doing or every cycle you're doing, it's full body animation, right? Whereas with the character animation, you might just have a shot that's like chest up or something. So
it's true.
Another reason why cycles are really body mechanics heavy. And then if you're more of the crowd technical person, those people might be more of a mix of technical and artistic skills. Like Katie was saying, there's a lot of, technical side of populating a scene with this number of animations, and you have to randomize them at this sort of this particular, I don't know, integer or whatever. I'm just saying
you can adjust speeds of the cycle and
there you go, exactly. So things look random even though it might just be 3 or 4 different cycles. And then obviously the artistic side, though, you have to be able the artistic side as well, meaning you have to be able to look at a crowd and just say like, yes, that looks like a natural crowd to me versus that looks like something that's computer generated. So that's a very, artistic eye, obviously. And basically, just to sum it up, crowds, the technical artists are good at breathing life into different environments, like a city or a town or people on a beach or whatever. You just have to be able to take this big landscape and make it look like it's very naturally populated, which can be much more challenging than a lot of people think. You have to make it very specific and varied so it feels natural, but then also keep budgets in mind and stuff. So it's a tricky position.
It's another one of those jobs where if you do it right, no one notices it. I think in terms of like fun facts and stuff, I think it's important to reiterate that there is like a distinction between crowd animators and crowd artists. Like I think Katie and Ben talked about, like crowd animators are doing the cycles, they're actually animating the characters, and then crowd artists are taking the cycles and propagating them into the scene. So those are two different jobs. I think depending on the studio, they're working very closely with the animation department, and oftentimes they're completely integrated into the animation department, but sometimes they're not. So it really depends on the studio.
Just briefly, some more examples of like what the technical skills might involve. Like crowds, tech artists might be setting certain rules, like making sure characters don't walk into walls, making sure characters don't walk into each other. If there's a group of characters running, like I remember in Frozen 2, there was a scene where everyone was running and they had to cross a bridge. They actually set it so that the characters had to slow down when they kind of converged on the bridge, sort of like they're funneling out. So those kinds of things like would involve sort of the more technical side. And kind of a cool like special example of something that crowds artists might do is like on Frozen 2, there's a scene where a bunch of reindeer start running and they actually form a circle and run in a circle. So that's something they had to like especially figure out and kind of iterate on.
So now we move on to character effects and tech anim. Woo! And the Explain Like I'm 5 for that job is basically they handle anything that moves on a character that isn't part of the character animation itself. So obviously characters might have hair or clothing where they might be interacting with props, and all that stuff is handled by the character effects and tech anim departments.
I will add that for Disney, tech anim artists do sometimes do some like close shaping of the characters, and they can sometimes shape the anatomy of the character just to try to make things more graphic or more on model.
A little more robust at Disney, than at other studios, maybe.
They might be doing some frame by frame sculpting of a character's model and that sort of thing. But for the most part, tech anim handles cloth and hair sim and that kind of thing. And the type of person a tech anim or character effects TD might be is there someone who's able to study and replicate real world physics. So They'll absolutely do things like blow a fan on a piece of cloth to see how wind affects cloth or something like that, and try to understand, what happens when wind passes through cloth. They're very mixed in terms of their technical and artistic skills. You'll see a recurring theme with this pipeline is everyone kind of has a mix of technical and artistic, because they are actively running simulations, like what happens to hair or cloth when it gets wet, or what happens when it's windy, or anything like that. And they definitely have a very keen eye for detail, where they are, like character animators, they're working frame by frame to get the best performance out of the hair and cloth that they possibly can.
That's right. And some fun facts about character effects / tech anim is that they generally work very, very closely with animation. They're, totally intertwined, those two departments. I have to say, like, almost, unless your character is completely naked and has no muscle or fat or anything, you're going to be, working with character effects in some regard if you're an animator. And it's really cool. I have to say, I love working with those people, because they usually, it's part of animation, just like anything else, where you're deciding on the silhouette of a character and nice storytelling poses with the cloth and hair simulation and everything. As one of these artists, you might get to work on super fun stuff. Like, for example, in Wreck-It Ralph 2, like his belly popping out of his princess dress when he was, stuffed into that. I was totally, probably like 70% of that or more was a tech anim artist just doing that simulation on like the fat and jiggly stuff popping out of that
the dress breaking and popping. Yes, and the dress.
Yeah, that's the more obvious thing. Even the dress.
But they definitely. I remember they worked on the belly jiggling and
And then, in addition to that, you might even be helping to keep the characters on model. Again, I'm going to reference Wreck-It Ralph in this way, but they often made him feel much more square and kind of pixely than other characters. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that was more easily achieved in effects than it was even in animation, because the rigs didn't have exactly the same sculpting tools that they did in character effects. So it can be really varied, their responsibilities. And off the top of my head, I'm also thinking of his Dark Materials, the Golden Compass TV show. I know effects artists did a lot of work with the polar bears with cool muscle and fat simulation when the polar bear is walking to make him feel really weighty and realistic. And I think a lot of times animators actually get the credit for those things when actually it's exactly when it's actually a character effects or tech anim person doing all that work.
Another hidden job where it's your job well. You're not the character effects and that was really great. No normal person would say that.
That's exactly right. Yeah, you're totally right.
They very often fix interpenetrations that animators can't fix. So if your elbow is somehow penetrating your belly or something like that, and it's too hard to fix it with the rig, tech anim will go in and sculpt that and make it look better.
Yeah, even something simple as you have a character with their arms resting at their sides. A lot of characters are so big and bulky that you have their arms and torsos penetrating them. And then it's an effects artist who has to go in there and clean all that up and to make sure that things are not actually penetrating, or if they are, it's not visible from camera, and do simulation on top of that. So it is a ton of very artistic work that often goes unrecognized.
Totally.
Those people are amazing. So next, we are going to be talking about effects. This could be... So what do you think? Water cannons, explosions, smoke, everything.
Fire.
That's true. That's all
Michael
true.
Michael Bay.
Yeah. But also, it can be, slightly more subtle things. It can be footprints in snow or sand or whatever. It could be some dust that's kicked up on the ground. It can be... I don't know, a little saliva that spits out of
Whoa,
someone's
man.
mouth when they're saying something with a lot of S's in it, like Slytherin or something. I don't know. That just has one S. I don't know why I use that as an example. But yeah, or it could be more abstract things like Elsa's magic or a...
Elsa's being plugged hard.
Yeah, she really is. Yeah, my gosh, you would think we work at Disney or something.
I know.
But yeah, so it can be real world effects or made up things. Telepathic energy. You know how that shows up on screen, or so any of those things. That's what we're talking about.
Yes, and you might enjoy the effects department if you enjoy observing real world physics in live action footage. As well as have a working knowledge of basic physics principles, and the ability to work realistically or stylized. And the example we have for this is like, How to Train Your Dragon, the fire and water effects might be a little more grounded in realism versus like Elsa's magic, which is a little more fantastic. Keep bringing up Elsa.
Or if we say like Trolls World Tour, there's a lot of like things in that are like super stylized. Everything looks like fabric. So just that's off script, FYI. I just jumped in with that thing.
Just jumped in there.
Oh my God. We actually were slated to talk about that later, and Katie just pointed it out to me, and I ruined it. Oh my God.
Editing this out.
Keep this out. My God. Okay, keep going.
No,
I apologize.
Okay.
It's a good point to discuss that, like, there is different styles when it comes to effects, just as there's different styles with animation. And as well as if you're the type of person who enjoys building tools that allow you to work quickly and iteratively and possibly working procedurally. Is there any more Elise I can add? Help me out here. But yeah, all those, that's effects for you.
Moving on to the miscellaneous info and fun facts section for effects. The effects department works very closely with animation, as we mentioned. They're definitely building off of the performances that the animators do. They also work very closely with tech anim in that same regard. If a character gets wet or something like that, and the effects department would obviously be in charge of the water, but then also work closely with tech anim to make sure that the cloth looks realistically wet, and there's definitely interaction there. And they also work very closely with lighting, so there might be very specific lighting that they want to hit with the effects. So the first example that comes to mind is another Frozen 2 example. So Bernie the salamander had a special magic fire, which was actually purple and pink. So that was definitely a collaboration between effects and lighting there. In some cases, effects can be handled in compositing. And as we mentioned before, Ben was talking about trolls. There might be instances where you need kind of more specific, practical manual effects. Another example that immediately comes to mind is if you've seen the Lego movie, they did tons of very cool stylized effects with the Legos. Like there was Lego water, Lego fire,
cool.
And that sort of thing. Within an effects department, you might find artists that kind of specialize in different types of effects. So you might have people that are more comfortable with fire or water, much like character animators are more comfortable with comedy or drama or body mechanics, physical acting. Effects people also sometimes specialize in that way. And yeah, they do a lot of building tools. If a sequence is going to have like a ton of dust kick up, they might kind of build a setup that they can use over and over again to make dust. Like the first example that comes to mind is I actually helped with Ferdinand at Blue Sky, and they were doing bull racing. So they built a special dust tool for that they kind of used and would use different or would adjust settings depending on the shots for.
Where haven't you worked?
I know.
You've worked in every department.
Next, we are moving on to general TDs, which stands for technical directors. The layman's explanation for TDs are that they are generally sort of pipeline engineers and help with sort of general problem solving and tech support. So if you're finding issues in your shot, they could kind of help you dive in and diagnose and figure out what's wrong or what might be broken. And on top of that sort of problem solving, they actually build and create tools which can help sort of improve the process and maybe improve the UI or the user interface. So they might be building tools like, for animation, a better play blast system, which lets you kind of preview your animation or that kind of thing.
Yeah, these are the people you go to when you have a problem. And that's like literally like if you have an issue, you go to a TD and it's so invaluable. The type of people who might be interested in this are people who are really good problem solvers, very tech savvy people. And oftentimes we found that they have backgrounds in like computer science. So they're really knowledgeable about, computers and tech stuff. As well as it's really important to have good soft skills because, artists, if they encounter a problem, they can get really grumpy and they might not have the best way. I know Ben especially with the problem. That's right. Animation. He swears. It's really bad. Right. He swears. He goes, fucking... I shouldn't. Wow. Yeah. Podcast. I was going to make a joke. What was going to happen after that? Forget I said anything.
For the record, Ben's very kind to TD.
Thanks, everyone.
Ben is very kind. I'm sorry. I was just being funny. But yeah, no, it's soft skills are important. Should I redo that?
No. I like it. Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry. He goes, fucking... I didn't know what was going to come after that. I was like, wow. I was just trying to yes and everything, the improv rule. But
yeah.
I'm so like, sorry.
Gracious. What am I agreeing to here?
It would have been funnier if I did Katie. That would have been funnier.
Oh.
I am a Disney animator. Do you understand? Fix it. I don't care how you do it, nerd.
I'm usually like, if you have time, if you could, please look into this thing.
So as far as additional fun facts go, if you are a TD, you really can work with anyone and everyone in the department. Almost every department, I believe, if not actually every department, has their own set of TDs. And then sometimes the different studios, there are general TDs for the studio as well that will work with anyone. It could be somebody from story who's saying, okay, I'm trying to submit my boards for this sequence. For some reason, I keep getting an error. It's not going through. To an animator saying, hey, I opened up my shot and the environment isn't showing up. I don't know what's going on. Or it really can be anything. So it can be great for somebody who is just a general, like we said before, a problem solver who has varied interests, because more likely than not, you're going to be working with a bunch of different types of people on a bunch of different types of issues. So it certainly keeps things fresh, I would imagine. Yeah.
All right, so next we move on to matte painting. So the Explain Like I'm 5 for matte painting, they are the animation artists who create painted representations of landscapes, sets, and other locations as backgrounds for scenes that are either impossible to find or impossibly difficult to film. So I guess it's like they're the ones who kind of, we cheat. We're not making them in CG, but we're drawing them out because it's too expensive or for whatever reason, like we can't have them in CG.
That's exactly right. Yeah, every CG element generally requires a lot of computing power. So if you have a matte painter who can match 3D and 2D elements really well, you're saving yourself a ton of money because you don't have to have, modelers, look dev people, lighters working on that. You just have the one matte painter to kind of fill all those roles. Awesome. So if you want to be a matte painter, you are most likely very artistic. Essentially, you are a professional painter, of course, so obviously artistic. Another thing we have written down here is resourceful. Oftentimes you have to piece together kind of different miscellaneous elements and put them together, meaning maybe on some shows you'll have like, okay, we have these 3 elements for the background. You kind of have to combine these with a painting of, and even, more of a background.
It could be like you're mixing a sky with a mountain range with clouds with whatever would be in the background.
And maybe you have like certain elements of that sky built in 3D, but then you have to expand it to look like it's endless in 2D. A very specific example is on, again, this whole episode is like Frozen 2 and Trolls World Tour. But on Trolls World Tour, they used there was a lot of set extension with the sky here and there, and they used literally pictures of cotton candy mixed with pictures of clouds and stuff, and kind of combined them and painted things to give like a really, because everything in Trolls is very tactile, to give that very tactile, real feel while also kind of filling out the world. Because if you were to actually build a set that looks like an endless sky, that would be so much more money and so much more time intensive than having a really talented artist who can just paint it. And the last thing we talked about was, again, it kind of goes with just being a good artist. You have to have a good knowledge of color theory, perspective, etc. Because a lot of times you're dealing with set extension. That's probably the most common thing. So you have to really know how things look when they're receding into the distance, and be able to integrate different elements of a scene in a very seamless way.
Yeah, so generally they're like they're Photoshop wizards, kind of, where they're like combining different images and painting them to look seamless, and then painting them to kind of match what's been rendered. And in terms of like fun facts, like the departments they work with, they often work with modeling, like whoever's in charge of the environment model, and props, and they work very closely with lighting to make sure that the color is matching, like the color and cinematography that the lighter set up. And they'll actually work super closely with the production designer as well, because production designers are kind of in charge of the color script, which is sort of the overall look and lighting of the film. Maybe you guys, I will put these in the show notes. They're usually like a very broad overview of the entire film, where they kind of go sequence by sequence and kind of lay out what is the color and lighting going to look like. And the only other fun fact we have is that it's usually a very small department. It's a very niche position. I think at Disney, maybe we have like 3 to 5 matte painters. So it's definitely niche, but it's a super, super cool job and department.
Yeah.
And I think it definitely applies in the context of like when it's done well, no one mentions it type of thing.
Oh,
I don't know if I keep mentioning that. I hope that's okay. I just feel like it's important to mention, because I do feel like animation is the thing that everyone always mentions. And, there's so much else that goes into it that's not talked about, like map painting. So
you're totally right. I feel like the two main things are like animation and character design generally, or environment design.
Yeah.
And then everything else is, kind of very unjustly so looked over. But I mean,
or attributed to animation. And be like, wow, the hair looked so real. That animation's amazing.
Yeah,
totally. But that's like not our department.
And then Garrett's usually like, thank you. I did all of that.
I'm responsible for every frame.
Yeah. But in the case of matte painting, I feel like that's probably people misattributing it as like, wow, that CG is amazing. And it's like, no, it's actually, totally right. It's not rendered. It's not computer generated. This is a painting someone did.
It's a testament to how good it usually is.
Yeah.
Because honestly, I can almost guarantee in every single film you've seen, not just animated film recently, there have been matte painters that worked on it and that made images and sets that look like they were just taken from a live action camera or were part of the 3D set. And you assumed they were, but it actually was a 2D painting from a matte painter. Yeah. So they're incredibly talented people, and Garrett is totally right. Largely, their work goes unnoticed. So for the next stage of the pipeline, we are getting close to the end here. Ooh. Pipeline. So this is pipeline. So this is lighting / compositing. So for the explain it to me like I'm 5 section, we'll say In lighting compositing, you take the work from every other department and you render it, basically, meaning you get to the nearly final look of the film. And before that, I should backtrack a little bit. And a lot of times you're opening up like a 3D scene and you're taking elements, like we said, from every department, from animation, from CFX to effects, and you are placing physical lights in the scene to highlight certain things, to make sure certain things are in shadow. You're also dealing with color and stuff. So it's a really cool, really artistic and technical part of the process. But then, so you're setting all that stuff up, rim light, the bounce light, everything, general color, tone of the scene. And then you run it through the computer and quote unquote render it. And then what is spit out is something that is very, very close to the final look of the film. So there's definitely a lot of burden on the lighters and compositing artists' shoulders.
I mean, I know I can speak from personal experience. Wherever I see my animation lit, I'm like, oh my gosh, It looks so cool. Like they make it look like, the feature quality that it is. So.
I say that about Garrett shots too. When they're lit, I say, oh my God, it looks so cool. Just like that.
And so, what type of person should you be if you are interested in lighting? Well, let me tell you, you are an artistic and technical person.
Surprise!
And you enjoy. Yeah, that's like the number one.
Do you want to work in animation? You are artistic and technical.
Yes. But more specifically, to be a little more helpful, you have a good knowledge of color theory. That's very important, as well as having a focus on creating a general mood and atmosphere, as well as cinematography. Because after all, like Ben kind of touched upon, you're adding lights to a scene much like a person in live action would add we need a little more fill light, so add this fill light here. Like you having that foundation is super important for a lighter specifically, and compositor. Yeah.
For sure. Some quick fun facts about lighters. They actually do some effects work sometimes, like kind of more background effects, like say there's a lightning strike in the background or a fire off in the distance. They might kind of composite that in. They work very closely with the production designer, actually. So for when I was a lighting PA, in every single lighting review, we had the production designer, who at the time was Corey Loftus, in the meeting, and he would give notes like, can we reduce the shadow under Vanellope's chin? Can we add more of a pink glow to this character or something like that? And they work closely to kind of tell the arc of the film in lighting and color. And we mentioned the color script earlier, so they're very much bringing that color script to life through CG. One kind of lesser known thing about lighting is that this is very often the last place where you can kind of catch a mistake or broken data being passed downstream. So sometimes you will see things interpenetrating, or maybe something has a flash or a pop. And that's kind of a signal that something maybe didn't quite make it down the pipeline cleanly. So they have super trained eyes that are good at kind of catching that sort of thing. One of the less fun parts about being a lighter is that they very often experience the worst crunch out of the entire pipeline, because they're sort of the last step. And every single shot has to go through lighting. So they can work some really tough, long hours at the end of the film. But if you're at a studio that pays overtime, it can mean you're making serious bank. So there are some pros and cons there. You might not realize this, but lighters can work on several shots at one time. Since rendering can kind of take hours or overnight, you will very often be assigned multiple shots that you can kind of bounce between while you're working. And you'll likely receive multiple shots within the same sequence, so you can kind of leave and use the same light setup for different shots and then make adjustments based off of where the characters are and where the camera is. So being a lighting soup might mean that you're kind of in charge of setting up the foundation lighting setup for a sequence, and then your artists who are sort of under you as a soup actually make the minor adjustments shot by shot. After lighting, we have the image finaling department. And the layman's explanation for image finaling is it's sort of the department for final tweaking, cleanup, sweetening, and color correction. So they are in charge of the final product in terms of the visuals, or from a visual standpoint. They are, the last line of defense, polishing the shot after it leaves lighting. And they actually might digitally fix and alter frames using Nuke for compositing. And they might also kind of color correct across shots. It's possible that within lighting, from artist to artist or shot to shot or sequence to sequence, the color might be just slightly inconsistent. And they might kind of color correct that. And they can also help diagnose rendering issues. So they might diagnose that by... somebody else wrote this, and I have to admit, I don't entirely understand it, so I will just read it verbatim.
Somebody else, as in Garrett.
Some other idiot.
No, I'm the idiot who can't understand it.
No.
Okay, it says, the image finaling artist is responsible for diagnosing rendering issues within pre-set up Nuke scripts received from upstream departments.
Yeah, that's tough. I don't even know. I think I copy and pasted that, and I don't know what it is entirely,
Yeah, I could say, sometimes when you render an image and stuff, there might be little artifacts here and there with
that makes sense.
Grass or fur or whatever. And I'm sure, trust me, I'm sure I'm oversimplifying too, but there are situations where it's probably cheaper to have an individual artist do a pass at cleaning that up in Nuke or whatever than it is to re-render the entire shot with all the 3D elements, because ultimately in image finaling, you're just dealing with a 2D image and kind of sweetening that. So as far as the type of person or skills you might need if you're interested in this, first is a very highly tuned artistic eye. This is you are responsible for the final image that is on screen. You're the final look of the movie. So you really got to know your stuff as far as, being detail oriented. You have to have a very good knowledge of color theory and such, because you're the last visual person to touch it. So any sweetening, anything is totally up to you. Just for an example, I'll talk about in, again, Trolls World Tour. This is the Frozen 2 Trolls World Tour, show right now. But I had a couple shots with Queen Barb where she was leaning on a bar, like a jail cell bar. And she had her fist against the bar. And I noticed the image finaling people, there was already like a tiny bit of a shadow there where her hand was touching the bar. But they added a much more defined contact shadow to just really handle that. On top of any, color correction or anything. So, it could be fixing little IPs and stuff that are easy enough to fix in 2D. It could be sweetening the color, making sure that things are consistent. It could be, like I said, selling a contact better. Could kind of be the name of the game for image finaling is a bunch of minor tweaks to really make everything sing and be more believable, I guess.
And yeah, I remember, how you mentioned that it might be cheaper for image finaling to go in there to fix something versus production to redo it. I just can speak from personal experience with my film. I remember doing a full HD render of like a sequence in my film. And there would be times where I was like, it would be faster for me to open up Photoshop and like clean up the penetrations on the things versus opening up Maya, fixing it in animation, and then rendering it out. Like, basically, I can see how image finaling makes so much more sense to do that, because it's such a pain. Even if you have a penetration that's like, you think, like basically the fingers are going through this prop, You'd think that would be easy, but it's just it involves so many departments. So
yeah, it can
sometimes it is easy,
also.
Go ahead.
It can also save on rendering time. Like I know that they'll kind of receive something that we call mats from lighting. So that's basically like they have layers for like different characters or the character's eye whites or something. And then the image filing artist can like make a character pop more, make them more bright so they contrast better from the background. And they're kind of tweaking things like brightness and contrast and color on like just the character or just the whites of their eyes or something like that. Sometimes like the whites of their teeth are even or something like that.
Absolutely, yeah. So they are another hidden gem of the animation pipeline. I think that they do a lot of fixes that you won't notice, but make a huge difference.
Definitely.
That's right.
So next we're going to talk about sound design. And this is a very broad job, but this kind of is self-explanatory. You know, our films are animated and they need sound, whether that's the music or the effects, you know, which effects could mean something as simple as a character walking and what's the sound of the footsteps on the type of ground, or, you know, anything, any sound you hear needs to be artificially created, and that is the job of the sound designers. So that is a whole section of the animation pipeline that is incredibly important. I think immediately I think of WALL-E and how the first, you know, act of that movie, maybe the first two acts, I don't remember, was totally no dialogue. It was just the sound of this robot in a really appealing way. And I remember seeing the behind the scenes of that DVD and being like, this is so cool. The passion and like the charm they added to that movie. So
I think that sound designer's name is Ben Burt, if I remember correctly, and he's done
fellow
like
Ben.
Love it.
He's done like everything from Star Wars to Raiders of the Lost Ark to Jurassic
Oh my
Park.
gosh.
Like he's made all of the famous noises, like the
Please come on our
lightsaber sound, Wally's voice, the T-Rex roar, like everything. I feel like
it's like unreal.
Yeah.
That's
He's
amazing.
So talented and inspiring. But anyway, I interrupted.
No, that's it. I mean, there's not much to it. It's any of the sounds you hear, that is the responsibility of the sound designers. So that's their job.
So I will add to that. Yes, sound design is everything you hear on screen, but there's kind of a delineation between sound effects and then the kind of music or orchestral
score.
The score. Exactly. Yeah. And specifically, that same guy Katie was just talking about, Ben, who he actually came to SCAD when Katie and I were there and gave a talk. We went and listened to him, and it was amazing. And he talked about how they are definitely two parts of a whole, the sound effects and score. But it's very important to make sure they're both strong on their own accord. He talked about it is really easy to, if you take storyboards or something and put them to this beautiful score, the movie may seem much stronger than it actually is. So it was really interesting that he actually recommended making a movie with just the sound effects and then later scoring it. And I'm sure there are a number of different opinions on that, but the reason we bring it up is just to say that there is a big difference between those two things, between sound effects and music, even though they're part of the same whole. So you might be more interested in one than the other, and that is totally fine because they are separate things.
Yeah.
Nice.
A traditional sound effects artist, the type of person that might be, is someone who's super resourceful and observant. So they pay attention to every single sound you can think of, whether it's just the way a wine glass is put on a table, or a footstep in snow versus a footstep in sand, or how do you combine XYZ sound effect to result in the lightsaber sound effect and that kind of thing. And they mix and match sounds to get what they want. And there's definitely a musical side to that. Like sometimes they will kind of have sounds digitally saved, and then they'll play them like even on a keyboard or on their computer to do the sound. And then on the other side of the coin, like the musical orchestral score for a film, it's certainly extremely musical. There's usually a single composer who composes the entire score for the film. They're very good at thinking big picture and kind of tracking the arc of the story.
Yeah, it's probably more so a musician first, and then like transitioned into like sound design sort of stuff. But
it's a huge huge part of the film, and definitely it's one of the most exciting parts where it super feels like it's coming to life. And what's funny is they both work to the film. So like they'll have the film playing, and then they either, if you're the sound effects artist, you're doing what they call Foley, where they like use objects sometimes and try to time it along to the film and record it that way if they need new sounds, or they'll pull from their libraries and add it on. And the orchestra actually has like a giant projection of the movie that they're playing to for inspiration and to keep track and making sure the music goes exactly with the film.
Yeah, and you'll actually see that on, if you have Disney Plus, the making of Into the Unknown, right? They actually go into that room where everything is being the orchestra is there, and you can see the movie. It's pretty cool. So as far as some additional fun facts, we want to say that a lot of the things that happen in an animated feature film, if you're at a place like Blue Sky, DreamWorks, Sony, etc., Disney, whatever, a lot of it is very much in-house. But the final sound stuff, especially the orchestra sound effects, are usually done off-site. For example, there's like Skywalker Ranch or something, which I think is up in the San Francisco area. I could be wrong.
I think so.
Yeah, where a lot of movies are made. And so it's usually something that for the final sound stuff, it's usually not like in the same building as everybody else. With possibly a few exceptions, but yeah.
And the only thing I would add is I remember going to film school, like sound is not viewed as the again, like the sexy thing. No one thinks of sound. They think of the visuals. And when you see a student film that has bad sound, it's like so obvious. And it takes away from it. So it's, again, I know I keep repeating this, but it's one of those things where if done well, you don't think about it. If done poorly, you're like, what is this horrible movie? You are so right. And I feel like there's a bunch of YouTube videos, right, that have like epic scenes without the music, and you can watch them and you're like, oh my God, like without the music, this doesn't just look less epic, it looks stupid, like it. So finally, we're going to talk about production management. Production management works alongside all other departments in the pipeline. So like everything we've talked about, they're also there working. So I know we put this at the end, but just know that it's not the final piece of the production. It's happening simultaneously with every other department.
Production staff generally help support the artists by scheduling meetings. They will also drive those meetings and kind of organize the playlist and agenda for meetings. They generally think big picture and set deadlines, and they're just sort of in charge of making sure things get done. And kind of the simple way to think of this, if you're not familiar, is to kind of think of the typical responsibilities and jobs of a project manager.
And you might be interested in production management if you are organized, detail-oriented, and strategic. And we also wrote here, if you love spreadsheets, Slack, emails, calendars, all that good stuff, you might be interested in production. It's also very important to be friendly and be a people person and social, although I do anecdotally know some more introverted production peoples, but I think generally...
I thought you were going to say, like, I know some really mean production.
I know some awful production staff. No. But we just put that there because you're going to be interacting with artists on a day-to-day basis and stuff, or other people. Great soft skills, ability to read the room. That's really helpful. Being able to think on your feet. Also, like, if you're really passionate about the world of animation, but you don't necessarily want to be a production artist, this could be a really good path for you. And I know a lot of people like that. And someone who can build the morale, when times get tough, and you're someone who can be an optimistic beacon of light for everyone. That'd be great.
So kind of a fun fact about production, whereas with a lot of other disciplines, there are only like 2 or 3 different levels to it, where you're like assistant animator, supervising animator, etc. Maybe head of animation. That's it. With production, there are many more levels. So you can be a PA, production assistant, production coordinator, production supervisor, production manager, associate producer, and producer, and possibly even more at different studios. But also kind of going along with that, a PA, generally speaking, is usually like the lowest paid person in the studio, maybe depending on the studio. But it's kind of a stereotype that exists, because it's usually the case. But then a producer on a movie generally is one of the highest paid people on a movie, if not the highest. So it's kind of a crazy thing, right? Like being on the production route, you can go from, if you were to work your way all the way up from PA to producer, which has happened at different studios, you can go from the least paid to most paid person in the same studio. So yeah, for sure. So also another fun fact is production people rotate between departments generally. It's from show to show. Like if you were on Frozen 2 and now you're on Raya and the Last Dragon, rarely do production people stay on the same within the same department, meaning you might be the production coordinator for animation, but then on the next movie, you're the production coordinator or a production supervisor for the effects department or story department or something like that. And then
that's cool.
Also, yeah, it is very cool. You can definitely, that's absolutely right. And Katie can probably talk more about that, but because she kind of jumped between.
Yeah, when I was on Wreck-It Ralph 2, I worked in lighting, story, editorial, and tech anims. That's 4 departments within one movie.
Yeah, pretty cool. So, and I think all of that, the purpose for that is to kind of get you trained in all these areas. So when you rise the ranks, you're able to have more of a global view of the whole pipeline.
Totally.
And can decide budget stuff because you've been in all these different departments. So you know what you're talking about. But that being said, the job responsibilities can vary a lot depending on which department you're in. So as we're going to discuss as we go throughout this episode, the departments can be super different. So it makes sense that if you're handling the production side of things for your department, your responsibilities will vary quite a bit. For example, if you're in animation, you just might be taking director notes for each animator's shot and passing those along and making sure they get implemented. If you're an editorial, you might be, receiving all these different things from different departments and making sure they get incorporated into the, the final mix, quote unquote, or final edit for the movie. You might be sitting in on voice recordings if you're an editorial or something else. So it can be, even though there can be, let's say there are 30, there's probably more, but let's say there's that many production assistants at a feature film studio, their everyday responsibilities could be night and day difference depending on what department they're in.
So lastly, before we wrap up the pipeline, we do want to give some mention to sort of the high level leadership, which sort of exists outside of the CG pipeline, like they aren't their own department. And what I mean by this is positions like the director, the screenwriter, the producer, etc. So if you guys aren't familiar, the director is the person calling all of the creative shots for the film. They are in charge of overseeing the creative direction, and they're giving acting notes to animators and giving lighting notes to lighters, etc. So they work very closely with every single department to shape the direction of the film. The screenwriter is in charge of the script, so they are definitely writing the dialogue and working with the story team to create the story arc and kind of decide what happens in the film beat by beat in script written form. And lastly, I'll mention the producer, who is kind of the mastermind behind getting the film done and on budget. So they are working very closely with production management and creative heads as well of the departments to make sure that the film can be completed on time. And there's tons of strategy involved, deciding, when is something safe to put into production, or when do we need to press the pause button on something because we know it's getting cut, or how many people can we afford to hire for animation to make sure that the film gets done, or that kind of thing. So the producer, they're kind of like the giant project manager for the entire film. And they do work very closely with both the creative side and the production management, kind of nitty gritty strategic side. They're in charge of the money. That's another kind of quick way to say it.
And they make the money.
Yeah, and the only last thing I'll add to those positions is that they also work closely with corporate if you're working at a studio like Disney. So they will be actively pitching and presenting the film to kind of the heads of Disney, the corporate board with like Bob Iger, Bob Chapek, etc. But yeah, those are absolutely, again, like we said with development, they're not positions that you're going to walk into entry level, but they're worth mentioning because they are definitely a huge part of the pipeline. All right, that brings us to the tip jar.
I wish you could see the eclectic mix of things we're bringing together right now. It's Quarantine. My wedding ring on a plastic glass. It's a shot glass against like a
water bottle because I'm responsible.
Yeah. All kinds of stuff. Basically everything but 2 chalices of beer.
Unfortunately.
Chalice is not the right word. I don't know why I said that. Anyway, continue.
That was the worst time for me to drink.
No, keep that in because that proves that Garrett is taking sips of beer.
Taking sippies.
This is a happy hour.
Of beer. So our tip today is very important and it's very underutilized, we think. But it's all about ergonomics. Especially when we're working from home. Mm-hmm. Right now, ergonomics is super important. And what that means is basically prioritizing the physical way you're working, whether that's, whether you have a standing desk, whether you're sitting down for long periods of time, just taking a moment, taking a beat to, figure out the physical way you're working. And for me, I know I bought this thing that allows me to lift my computer on my desk so I can stand. And it's super important for me because I can't sit for like 8 hours a day. It really affects me to do
And you
that.
have really nice legs, so it's good to stand every now and then.
I have really nice legs, so it helps, push those muscles.
Yeah.
But yeah, I
think totally derailed him with your compliment.
Please interject on ergonomics because I lost all focus.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically like there's so many little things you can do to make sure that you don't develop some kind of chronic issue like carpal tunnel or arthritis or that kind of thing. So some other things that come to mind are make sure that your desk is at a height and your chair is at a height so that you can kind of keep a 90-degree angle in your legs when they're bent if you're sitting and in your arms when you have your hand on a mouse. You can also buy special computer mice and keyboards that are better sort of angled and arranged for your arms so that you don't have to have kind of an awkward twist while you type or while you click. Yeah. Ben, can you think of any others?
Maybe some blue light filtering glasses. It's kind of not exactly ergonomic per se, but still taking care of yourself. Generally, I think it's accepted that that's healthier for you to kind of filter out some of that blue light to not interrupt your sleeping patterns. And then, Katie, I'm sorry, remind me, what is there's some like 20-20-20 rule or something?
20, 20, 20. I think it's basically since we stare at a computer all day, it's good to take a break with your eyes every now and then and look at something that's like more than 20 feet away. And it can be as short as 30 seconds or something like that.
Or 20 seconds.
Maybe. I don't know if I have the same memory that it's like a 20.
I might have just made that up.
But that's a good thing to shoot for. Maybe every 20 minutes, look 20 feet away for 20 seconds.
Every 20 seconds.
We're going to copyright that.
Every 20 seconds, look away for 20 minutes.
That would also be beneficial.
So convoluted.
But on that note of the screen, make sure the screen's like not too close, that it's generally at the same height as your eyes so that you're not straining down or up, and that it's also more directly in front of you so that you don't have to constantly turn your head, because it sounds crazy with those little head turns. If you do them hundreds of thousands of times a day, it can really add up to neck strain and back pain.
Yeah, I keep that screen a healthy distance away. I can say every time I see Garrett on the Zoom call, I want to bring that screen as close as possible. And then Katie is like, leave it back a little farther. I'm like, and it's always this thing. But I know she's just looking out for my health, so I keep it a little farther away.
I saw your face. And I was like,
no, you had no idea. You had no idea that was coming.
Yeah. Well, back to some serious suggestions for a second. You can also get wrist rests, which are pretty important because it can definitely be a strain on your wrist to hold it. These guys are still laughing and like visual and like flirting with their eyes. I can see it.
No, gosh.
But yeah, definitely take the time to just make sure that your setup is working for you and that you're not setting yourself up for injury long term.
That's very right. Important. Yeah, all very, very good tips. Please keep those to heart. We know they sound like soft suggestions, but they are really, really important, especially if you're animating for, 20, 30 years. These habits make a huge difference.
There are special stretches, too, that you can do with your wrist and forearms to make sure that you're actively avoiding carpal tunnel, especially if you're in a discipline like VizDev or Story where you're drawing all day. It definitely can take a toll.
So, and with that, we're coming to the end of our episode. We hope you enjoyed this. We sincerely hope. Check out our show notes for other relevant resources. There are a lot of great resources out there that also cover the pipeline. For example, DreamWorks has a great video you can find on YouTube with the penguins of Madagascar talking about the pipeline. That's kind of like a super quick overview of what we just talked about. It's like 15 minutes long, but they cover just about everything we did here.
Yeah, and have a visual component, which is so helpful.
Yeah, exactly. Here, you just have to imagine how attractive Garrett is. But trust me, if there was a visual opponent, you would see it. All right, next. Also, cgspectrum.com has some great, talks about the pipeline. Also talks a little bit about the day in the life of different artists, which can be very valuable if you're not sure exactly what you want to do. The Rookies website is a good one to expose yourself to different, areas within the pipeline, figure out what might appeal to you. NoFilmSchool.com, and honestly, a bunch of other stuff. If you
it's
just
literally in our notes, a bunch of stuff.
That's what we wrote down here, because honestly, like we said, at the very beginning of this episode, working in animation can mean almost anything. So really take the time to educate yourself on what might most appeal to you, because obviously when everybody hears DreamWorks, Disney, whatever, Pixar, Blue Sky, Sony, they think, oh, you work there, you're an animator. But that is, such a small percentage of the people who work at these studios are actual character animators. So do yourself a favor, take a breath, take some time to just do some research, and it'll be super fun. You can see what appeals to you. Treat it the same way you would treat what Hogwarts house you fit into as what
that's a good point.
Step of the pipeline most appeals to you. It's a fun thing that's kind of dependent on your personality and your skill set. So take some time to do that.
So it's now time to give our last sort of social media plug. We can be found on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Our website is animationhappyhour.com. On our website, we now actually have a tip jar active, which is a place where you can donate to the where you can donate to the podcast and support us. Putting on a podcast, it does cost money. We have to buy equipment. We have to host the podcasts online. So we
Garrett
appreciate
is
your
very
support.
Expensive. His time. I can't tell you how much money we've thrown at him.
We also newly have merchandise for sale. You can find us on Threadless. I think the website is animationhappyhour.threadless.com, but there's also a link on our website. And lastly, we have a mailing list. So once a month on the 15th, we send out episode reminders and a series of fun animation links. And it's just a very simple, quick little newsletter.
Yeah. Curated by our very own Katie Lowe.
Yes,
so
I promise. I promise it's...
We should call it the lowdown. What are we doing?
Lowdown.
Oh,
I don't know why we didn't.
Yeah.
The animation
My dad
lowdown.
would be flattered.
That's right.
Yeah. But yeah, I promise it's a nice, fun little sort of clickbaity, but catered to animation newsletter where we'll send cool demo reels, cool new trailers.
Yeah.
And
Clickbaity, but with substance.
Yeah, we might.
You're being baited, but you're happy.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we include job listings, which everyone wants to know about job listings, and our special speakers or panel events that are coming up. So take a moment to visit our website and subscribe.
Hey.
Yes, please. So
Beautiful.
It's my favorite. I want you to edit that "yes, please" after like everything.
Yes, please.
yes, please.
So image filing deals with the detail work. Yes, please. You have to be detail oriented. Yes, please.
I'm going to kill myself after this editing.
You're like the actors of the movie. Yes, please.
I'm quitting this podcast. That can be the last.
No.
Okay, because I made you the end of the last episode. I can do the yes, please.
So I will say, even though I was a little self-conscious, I thought that was a
It's
beautiful,
funny.
artistic little thing, and I
Thank
commend
you.
you for it, Garrett. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay. Beautiful.
All right.
All right. So that about wraps it up for the episode, guys. This has been Garrett.
Ben.
And Katie, thanks for listening, and happy
animating!
And everything else in the pipeline too.
Yes, please.